Good evening. I'm Edward Kennedy. This is episode 1 of my new podcast, OFM, Only from Memory. I'm migrating this from my Sam's Bulldog persona, I guess. Happy to still play that role, of course, but like to talk about some new things. And so I will be sticking with really one of the things I enjoy most, as you know, which is going after liars. I don't think they help. But of course I like to talk about other things, and I'm going to kick it off. I dreamed this up, the name and so on. It's really not relevant. What is relevant is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to call it OFM, Only from Memory. That's me, my memory. There will be no notes. There will be no Googling. There will be no minimized windows on the MacBook Pro or the iPad or the iPhone. Okay, what I'm going to do is perhaps come with a subject, something I saw that day, something I saw that week, whatever I want to do, and talk about it and how it loops in with lots of other things I like to talk about. The key is to just start with a news item and then talk about implications, the history, the geography, and so on. So it's quite simple. Let's see where it takes us. I'm doing this for my pleasure. I always enjoyed building timelines. I love facts, but I also like timelines, because if one can think of history, frankly, the whole span of history, as a series of events in the broadest possible terms, and then fill in those events with, plant flags and that kind of forward-looking, forward-back timeline. You just fill in with more and more data, and it gives you a bigger picture. And so there's always something to help to fill in data. I love the year 1927, for example, and anytime I find anything new about 1927, I fill my mind in with 1927 ideas. Like Murderers Row, Tony Lazzeri, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and what's his name? One more. But so, of course, this being the first of the new idea, I thought I'd start with the beginning of Western civilization, and that's Socrates. And I guess it's why he still matters. And I've spoken about him. On some previous videos. I find his life fascinating. Not just the life he led as a quote-unquote normal Athenian, but the life he led and why we know him so well. So today, and why he still matters. The death of Socrates is basically the oldest, firmest, still living example of free speech has to win. That's it. Everything else is conversation. It's the only thing worth dying for sure. It's got to be the first on everybody's list. Because once that goes, it's good night, Irene. So, I thought I'd just start talking about him. And I'm not going to give details, but I guess for the first, I'll say I didn't research for this. And it's been years since I read about Socrates. I read about him intermittently for, maybe 5 or 10 years. I went to Greece twice. I did a lot of preparation, learning, before I went to Athens, and then I went to Crete and the islands and so on, and haven't been to the north where Alexander is, but Greece is big and small at the same time, as you'd imagine, when you're talking about antiquity and 3,000 years of history. Excuse me, and even more. So, excuse me. So why Socrates? Why do we care about Socrates today? What is he supposed to mean today? What did he do? What did he look like? How long did he live? What were his impacts? He's a fascinating guy. I mean, he may be the most fascinating person who ever lived. Who nearly certainly did live, although there are no bones or graves. There is so much contemporaneous and near contemporaneous information about him and his backstory that basically no one doesn't think he was real. So, who are we talking about? We're talking about a guy who died in 399 BC, so 2,418 years ago. He committed suicide. He was about 70. He's certainly portrayed in the histories, or I shouldn't say histories, I should say in the statuary art. He's portrayed like Homer-esque, the old, bald, bearded man, indicating wiseness, not surprisingly. Homer is anachronistic, excuse me, not anachronistic. The Homeric busts you see do stretch back, but I don't think that anybody thinks it's anything more than an idealized portrait. However, with Socrates, the fact that he was real, they know when he lived. Homer, we don't know anything about. He was known to the most famous people of the day in the Athenian polis, the country of Athens, which was arguably the most powerful city-state on the peninsula, and probably that included Turkey as well. So he was born in like 430 BC. Excuse me, call it 475 BC, which is let's say 100 years before the height of classical Greece, which one may say is something like 375 BC. But of course it depends on the discipline you're talking about, the art you're talking about, the architecture, is it poetry, science, so on. So roughly at the beginning of the Archaic period, which is what they call it. So he was born. Excuse me, I have allergies and I also have a cold, so that's why I sound like this. You could say he kind of ushered in the classical era by his life. 500 BC. After 500 BC, you could say starts the classical age, and then it goes to, let's say, really the death of Alexander, but you go another 50 or 100 years perhaps. So you're looking at 300 years between 500 BC and 200 BC. So that ended when Julius Caesar was born. So classical Greece declined and was overtaken by Rome, thanks to brilliant military hegemony, I guess. We'll talk about what Rome achieved and how they surpassed Greece and how they didn't, as far as I'm concerned. Both wonderful, but both quite different. Getting back to Socrates. Socrates is considered the founding mind, the founding brain of Western civilization. So if you take a Western Civ class, which I've never done, but Western civilization, presumably, you are talking about the precursors of those polis in Greece that we all know, Sparta and Athens and so on. And they were then, call it 800 to 1,000 years before, you have the Homeric age that Homer wrote about, with Mycenae and Agamemnon, who was not real, but there were extremely powerful kings. And you can see the Lion's Gate, actually, they're lionesses, they are not males, and they have been in the Lion's Gate. It's 9 o'clock, that's what that was. Excuse me, you can see that today on the citadel of Mycenae, overlooking the Argold Plain. You're looking at a society that ruled the Mediterranean, or the Aegean, 1200 BC, 3,200 years ago. Spectacular cultural achievements way back when, really way back when. And the tombs have been excavated by a guy named Schliemann. We'll talk about him, supermarket millionaire German, who wanted to prove the Homeric legend's real. But I'm going far afield. Let's get back to Socrates and why he matters. Socrates was, as I recall it, middle class at least, and probably above middle class. I don't think he was from Athens. He was from the Styx, but he was educated and showed promise and so on. He fought in the Peloponnesian War. I believe he was an officer. He fought on the Athenian side. The Peloponnesian War was a long, drawn-out intra-Greek world civil war that lasted for about 30 years. I believe it ended in 431 BC with the defeat of Athens and the destruction of Athens for the most part, if not physical destruction, complete capitulation at the hands of the Spartan side, of which there were alignments and treaties, and this went on for decades. And Athens should have won. Athens should have won. And they were hit by a plague. They're not sure what it was. Certainly something you and I probably wouldn't die from. Because the walls were up to keep out the opposing side, that disease spread in things like water, food contamination, and so on, living quarters, air. It cost the lives of many. Excuse me. So, he goes and he fights well in the Peloponnesian War. Frankly, I'm not sure what he does. Let's say between 30 and 60. He may have taught. I'm pretty sure he taught. But it doesn't matter. What's most interesting is he starts, by all accounts, acting strange. And he acts strange in a strange way. He lives outside. He lives in the shade in Athens, which is a very small place. Probably 5 to 1 slaves who were largely educated and just from outlying areas. There were all kinds, of course. He enjoyed spending his days talking to people. And this is what he's most famous for, the Socratic method, which is a nice way of saying deductive reasoning, asking why, and moving from a place of thinking you have knowledge. It's epistemology. This is what we're talking. Why? How do we know what we know, and what do we know, and what will we never know, and what will we never know we'll never know? This is not funny. This is what people think about philosophers, and he is the, quote, first in the Western tradition of rhetorical speech and asking why, and he would talk to people. He was very unkempt. He had very dirty feet that he never washed. He, as I said, he slept outside. He was friends with the luminaries of Athens, the greatest minds, the richest, the most patrician. They knew him, they respected him, and they liked him. But he was a little flaky as he got older, not surprisingly, living outside, although this is a long time ago, and that kind of thing wasn't, especially in Athens with the heat and so on, wasn't perhaps that crazy looking. So what happens? He maintains his friendship and he talks to his friends and always wants to have a conversation, and he strikes them as just odd but harmless. And he always asks why. Do you believe in God? Why? Do you believe in the gods? Why? Do you believe in the afterlife? Do you believe Athens should have won? Do you believe that the Persian kingdom is going to fall? Etc. So, of course, these things got far more pedantic, and that's when they get interesting. How do bees find each other and build a hive? How do maggots seemingly spontaneously create when something dies? So he's the father of the scientific method, of discursive thought, of epistemology, of logic. I'm no expert on any of these, of course, but this is my impression as him being the seminal figure of Western thought. Seminal is the ability to give birth to something. So if you're talking about Western civilization and who the seminal figure is, you were talking about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, Demosthenes, the playwrights, the traditions, tragedians, however you say that, and so on. So we're talking handfuls of people here that have been swaying the Western world for 25 centuries. Pretty fascinating stuff. So I think I said in the other video about what happened to him and what his dialogue, what his talk got him. What did it get the people around him, and what did it get him? And really, most importantly, what did it get us? And to understand that, you need to think about him as a rebel in the 1950s in the States. Think James Dean. Guy who didn't give a shit. Guy who didn't take anybody's word for it. Guy whose trust you had to earn. A guy you couldn't figure out. Still waters run deep. You know, think of any cliche you want. So what we have here is a very interesting flaky guy who's like the guy at the end of the block who looks homeless but harmless. And he isn't homeless. He's just a flaky dude who likes to talk to people. This was all a wonderful exercise for the patrician class in Athens. They had their wealth and their position, and they protected him, and Socrates, nothing could have happened to him unless something changed in that class that protect him and that actually he was part of. And of course that's what happened. So he has these conversations. He points out people's inconsistent moral philosophies, inconsistent thoughts about the natural world. And this leads to fascinating dialogue. Here's the problem. The next generation starts hearing about it. And just like gay marriage in the 50s, even though people knew, gay people knew what the story was, this is something that wasn't discussed, at least openly. Excuse me. So, what do you think happens? the older generation, who knows Socrates, isn't threatened by him at all. But the younger generation, who's having their heads filled with new ideas, is starting to alarm the class of that people of matter in Athens. And what do they hear? Radical new ideas. Not taking the priest's word for it, or the archon's word for it, or the general's word for it, or the orator's word for it, or the lawyer's word for it. Skepticism, plain and simple. And not for a goal. The goal was the trip down the rabbit hole. And this is another thing, of course, why he's so famous. So what happened? Those in charge got a little tired of hearing about him from the youth. And he was charged with impiety and corruption of the youth. Impiety. Where have we heard that before? Translation: the theocrats remembered to get theocratic and protected the gods as they saw fit. The worship of the gods. In the same way, mocking Islam in certain places in the world will get you more than a cross look or the denigration of sacred images of Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism. Just run the table. We're talking about impolite mocking, the mere suggestion that man is held down by these invisible gods. Of course, Socrates is very well known for saying that the only thing he knows is his own ignorance. It's been said a million different ways. But not surprisingly, those that learn all the time for joy learn two things: what they're reading, or what they're observing, and constantly being made aware of how little else they know. The complexity never seems to end. And that's another topic. Atomization. Greeks invented the atom. Democritus, I think. Interesting name. Demos means people. Democracy. So, impiety. And corrupting the youth. They were getting tired of him asking questions. He was stirring the pot. And those in power, if there's any pot stirring going on, it's going to be by them, not by the soft underbelly walking amongst them, doing nothing but asking questions and sitting in the hot Athenian sun. So he's charged. He's charged with a crime. He's charged with the crime of blasphemy and corrupting the youth. he is approached by a number of wealthy Athenian citizens and others, and they make the offer to simply spirit him away or pay a bribe. Not surprisingly, bribes were common, and as I recall it, not all that unethical either. You could pay to do your time. Not 100% on that, but certainly wasn't set up like our society today. He refuses all the offers of money, safekeeping, horses, you name it, disguise. He says, no, I'm not going anywhere. His students get very upset. And again, by this time he has, quote, students. He did not start a school. That was Plato, his student, and arguably the most, certainly the most, I believe the most extant philosophy, right? Excuse me, writings are from Plato, Plato Republic, and so many others. I've only read one, which was about a dinner party, which has imaginary characters in it, including Socrates and Alcibiades. And many other luminaries of the day. Trying to think of the name of it. The Symposium. I recommend it. If you want to read the most famous names, most of which were alive at that time, but it is fictionalized, as I understand it. So it is Plato who starts his school at the foot of the Athenian Acropolis. And then Aristotle was a famous student of Plato who eventually took over the school. Aristotle was a very scientific, as I recall it, more of a science guy than a head guy. And Socrates wasn't anything other than a search for truth, a search for conversation, a search for new ideas. And for his new ideas and his new approaches, he develops a following of the youth for which he so greatly influenced. They pleaded with him to please flee, to please save yourself, even though you're old, even though you don't want to leave your town. But the students are jealous. They don't want him to go. They don't want him to die. They want him to survive so they can treasure him and his ideas longer. Socrates, of course, refuses and says, in jail, which you can see, which I believe is on Mount Arapigus. I could be wrong. It may not be Arapigus. It may be the other hill, which starts with an L. It's hard to pronounce. These are hills that are in Athens, just like the 7 hills of Rome. Athens has an Acropolis, which is a rocky, raised plateau, typically, which is very good for defense and military situations and so on. You have his students being more and more distressed by Socrates' made-up mind. And he tells them that because this is his society, and because societies are made by contracts of understanding, if you are to live in that society and reap its benefits and contribute, then you live by its rules, you leave, or you change those rules. And presumably Socrates wanted changes, I would argue, for a more secular approach to well-being, a more grounded approach to well-being, a less pantheistic approach to well-being. He had lived a long life. When you're in your 70s and gray-haired, although there are many that lived to close to 100, certainly, and others that did live past 100. In Rome, certainly. These were spectacularly rare events, obviously. So he was considered wise and valuable as a veteran, as I said. Tells his students there's no way he's not leaving. He will accept the punishment that his society deems necessary. He goes to his students, or they go to him in the jail, desperately trying to persuade him, to save his life for the better good. Socrates, instead, continues his lessons of why, and he begins to drink hemlock. Hemlock is a poison that is still around today. It is a green plant. It is used as poison to put in the ear if you're a Shakespeare fan or so on. But you can make it powerful and eat it and so on, or you can drink it, make a tea of sorts, and my understanding is a nerve agent, and as you consume, you get slower and slower and slower, and your legs get heavier and heavier. So this is the image that has come down to us for 2,400 years. Socrates continuing to speak as long as he could, telling his students that ideas are worth dying for, and societies are worth dying for, and we're the only one who can change them. It falls to us to make the world a better place. The gods don't seem to be interested enough. They might be there, but they're not helping. He gets slower and slower, speech slower and slower. He continues to drink. He stumbles around. His students are wailing at the horrible loss of so fine a man. and Socrates dies. And why is it still important? Why is Socrates still discussed today? He's discussed because he never felt that he was wronged. He knew the rules, he flouted the rules, he upset the apple cart, and he paid the price. And for him, that was a perfect moral contract that was signed, sealed, and delivered. No problem. Completely acceptable. But he matters because he died for a principle. And that principle makes his life even unnecessary. It doesn't matter if he didn't exist, although he almost certainly did. I don't think he had children. I don't think he was a father at any time. I don't think if he did, I don't think they lasted until adulthood. He was a loner. A loner with a great military record of supporting his country. But he paid the price. He paid the price for free speech and not stopping. And there's no higher good. There's no higher good. All freedoms come from the freedom to express yourself. That's why Socrates still matters, and that's why he'll always matter, and that's why you go to the bookstore that doesn't exist anymore, and there's always a book, Death of Socrates. We always want to try to understand, what was he doing? Why did he do it? We have lots of moral characters in ancient Greece. Yes, they had their own motivation. Demosthenes, the father of public speech, of oratory, who was said to practice his speech with rocks in his mouth to improve his public diction. Demosthenes wrote the Philippics, public speeches attacking Alexander the Great's father, King Philip, and his hegemonic desires for the riches of Athens. So we can look to almost anybody back then, today, and we look not only at what they did. In fact, what they did oftentimes is irrelevant. I would say even religion matters here. I look at all religious story as myth. Those myths are written for a reason. Those memes are transmitted through the generations. And the meme of free speech, of rational inquiry, of believing your eyes, of not believing others' eyes, skepticism, democracy. These are principles we can't breathe without today. And we owe it all to him, because he started it. And he appears in the literature and the history and the science and the art and the poetry and the pottery of our shared past of beautiful classical Greece. So I'll be mentioning him a lot, not because I have a persecution complex. In fact, just the opposite. It was his willingness to persecution, his lack of consideration as far as his principles were concerned. This is a man to admire. And he just wants you to talk. I look at him as the greatest problem solver in human history. Certainly up until that date. And a man whose influence by living outside 100 generations ago still means so much to me and so many others. Stay tuned.